I'm so excited to be kicking off our final panel conversation this afternoon. Our moderator for this panel is Tom Michael, who's the general manager of Boise State Public Radio. He's been with BPR since 2016, and he came to us from West Texas, where he founded Marfa Public Radio and has an amazing knack for building regional networks, especially news bureaus like the Mountain West News Bureau that serves us. If, like me, you turn it on and listen in the morning when you're getting ready, it's a welcome, wonderful presence in my daily rituals. We're so delighted to have Tom helping us today with his moderation of our panel on optimizing siting and transmission. Please join me in welcoming Tom Michael and his panel.
Previous moderator Justin Hayes described this as a time of change, and we heard from the panelists on their challenges, but the time of change is also very exciting, and I feel like this panel is poised to be very solutions-based, real-world applications, especially for this public lands piece. So I'd like to introduce this panel again, full bios in the booklet. Just here to my left, on the right from your vantage point, Peter Gower, who we heard on our airwaves yesterday on Boise State Public Radio. He's the Climate and Renewable Energy Program Director for the Nature Conservancy in the Division of Western U.S. and Canada, which I believe is 11 states and 2 provinces. Okay. His resume includes work as an environmental consultant on land use planning and NEPA compliance projects. Peter lives in Reno, but earlier today he was in D.C. for his son's very cool civics conference, which sounded very impressive. Next to him, June Shoemaker. She's Associate State Director for the Bureau of Land Management. Has shared a variety of leadership roles there since joining the BLM in 2008. Today, she can share some details of projects in renewable energy and her approach to building partnerships. And she tells me one of her favorite activities in the state is hiking outside of Stanley. Next to her, Kristine Raper. She's Vice President of Strategic Engagement and External Affairs for the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. She also has the perspective as a former commissioner for 7 years at the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. And she tells me her favorite place in Idaho is Warm Lake, which I believe is Valley County. So wonderful to have these folks here. And I thought I would kick it off again after the presentations. They'll each have a presentation. So during that, think of your questions, put them on your cards, and send them up here. But I'd also like to recognize the students in the room and ask each panelist briefly if we could start by asking, how did you first get involved in the energy sector, and what kind of made you make that first move into this world? So, Peter?
Yeah, great question. So my background is in land use planning. So it's kind of a roundabout way to get into energy, but it started with a love of geography and maps and places, and a desire to do something about climate change. So I kind of took those two things together, and it was land use planning and looking at the environment and how things like renewable energy interact with the landscape. And voila, here I am with the Nature Conservancy working on renewable energy and climate change.
So, sorry, if you guys can hear me. Yeah, my experience is actually much more recent. Basically, Lava Ridge was when we first got involved with energy. It was my first experience with it. I've been in Idaho with the BLM for just a little over 8 years. And prior to that, I was in Arizona. And there was a lot of work that was happening in Arizona related to energy with the BLM, but that was not the area that I was focusing on. So since in Idaho, we've done a lot of work as far as thinking through where we're at, what we've experienced with the last project we have now that we're working through, and trying to sort of see what the future looks like for us and how we need to change how we do business and how we think about business to try to be a little bit more effective. But yeah, so I'm still learning really as we go.
When I was a small child in Delaware, no. My undergrad is actually from VSU, and it's in criminal justice. And after I finished my undergrad here, I decided that law school might be my thing. not in criminal law. So came out of law school and worked. I like state government. I think that you can wear the white hat. And I came out of law school and worked for the Industrial Commission doing workers' compensation, and then moved over to the Public Utilities Commission as a deputy attorney general for them for about 8 years before I was appointed to the commissioner job. And honestly, I wouldn't do anything but energy now. From the minute that I got there, it's like really steep learning curve, and then not even a glide path, right? It's a lot of information, a lot of acronyms, and a lot of stuff going on, but it is the coolest environment that you can work in. So for any students in the room, and we have a generation retiring and they have no one to give their institutional knowledge to, and we need somebody to give the institutional knowledge to. So that's my pitch for going into any sector of energy. It's a really dynamic field. It's constantly changing. It's always interesting. I have partners, friends, colleagues in the room that I haven't seen for a while that I always get to see at these kinds of events. And some of the smartest people I will ever meet in my life I've met in this field. So I would just encourage you to continue along the path if that's what you're looking at.
So we're going to have short presentations again from Peter, then June, then Chris, and feel free to use the podium or sit there as long as you can use the clicker.
Okay, I might just jump up to the podium then. Do we have the presentation? There we are. So happy to be here with you today. My role is to kind of give the opening, the preface for discussing optimizing siting and transmission, particularly related to public lands. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that the Nature Conservancy has done regarding energy siting and transmission, give a few examples of some of the specific strategies that we've done as well. So just to kick it off, really high level, I think that's the theme has come up a lot today. We have a conundrum, right? We are looking out into the future. There are a lot of studies, projections showing that the amount that we're going to be using electricity for things like electrifying the transportation sector, electrifying buildings, it's going to require more energy. There are more people using energy. 10 times the amount of energy, in fact, as we're using now. Wind and solar and other renewables are a way to get there. The challenge is that these technologies have a footprint. For solar, typically we use around 7 acres per megawatt. Wind, 80 acres per megawatt. Those are kind of rough numbers, but they occupy space on the landscape. It creates conflicts, right? And that's why we're having these conversations today is what do we do about these conflicts? How do we plan for them? I'm a planner, so I think about what kind of tools can we use to think about in advance to be able to plan for these conflicts. And the result is if we don't do something about this challenge now, that top box, that 10 times the energy that we need isn't going away. So we've got to figure out the tools and the strategies for getting there. So at the Nature Conservancy, we talk about using a balanced approach, and we use the term 3C approach: community, conservation, and climate. And really what it means is integrating all of these strategies together and looking at it holistically to be able to meet our energy needs. And I'm framing that as a context for not only the work that the Nature Conservancy does, but hopefully a little bit of context as well as a preface for our conversation today. One of the key tools that the Nature Conservancy has developed is called the Power of Place studies. There are 3 studies. We did our first one starting in 2019, and it looked at ways to achieve California's renewable energy portfolio standards. They have a Senate Bill 100 required 100% renewable energy by 2050. So we looked at, okay, what would it look like to achieve that renewable portfolio standard using the resources in California, mainly solar and some wind, but also outside of the state, pulling in solar from Nevada or Utah or wind from further away. We expanded that analysis a little bit more with Power a Place West in 2022. We looked at an economy-wide approach, a West-wide approach for essentially decarbonizing the West or meeting the renewable energy goals of the West Coast. And again, it's like getting to that top box, that 10 times energy increase. And then more recently, the Power a Place National, which took a national view. We used a little bit more of a sophisticated model for an avoidance continuum, looking at kind of giving weight to certain factors and identifying areas of higher and lower conflict. So really what this does is it creates a roadmap for moving forward from a status quo or kind of a business as usual siting scenario into one that's a little bit more focused on identifying some of the lower conflict, lower impact pathways for energy siting, energy generation siting, energy transmission siting. And it relies on this underlying foundation of environmental data, of economic data, to identify where these places are. It uses the Power a Place study, Power a Place National study, uses some assumptions for land saving approaches as well. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those as well in just a minute. So I want to encourage everyone to read the Power a Place studies. There are executive summaries on the Nature Conservancy's website, very digestible information. There are more technical studies if you really want to dive into some of the specifics, and the data is available as well. Spoiler alert is that we can achieve our economy-wide decarbonization goals by 2050 while avoiding the most sensitive working and natural lands in the West. We can get to that top box using a low conflict 3C approach. So Power a Place included 6 steps. We essentially started with exclusion areas. So that map on the left incorporates wilderness areas, sensitive habitat areas. These are all the places that, from a land use perspective, from an environmental perspective, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to site energy generation projects or transmission. The result is kind of what's left over is we identified these candidate areas for renewable energy. These may be lower impact areas that kind of rise to the top of, okay, that might make sense from a land use, a footprint perspective to site energy projects. We mapped those. We connected in the potential transmission pathways as well, and potential grid upgrades, simply a point A to point B of what it would take to get projects in those areas online. At that point, we disaggregated using some models about the energy economy, the demand, where the demand centers are, to start thinking about where those connections are and the amount of energy that would be needed in certain candidate areas to supply those demand centers. And then at the end of the day, we can understand what the impacts look like, what the footprints look like on the landscape, kind of at this macro level, right? I mean, this is a pretty macro level tool that can help facilitate decision making along the way. What we found is that they're using this approach, there's still 20 times the amount of suitable areas for solar development in the West, 3 times the amount of suitable areas for wind energy development in the West. We're not constraining the landscape to the point where none of this energy development can occur, but we're really focusing in on the areas with the least amount of conflict. Another just key finding that I'll mention as well, as you kind of start constraining the land uses based on potential for conflict, it essentially pushes the type of energy development from more of a wind-focused outcome to more of a solar in the Southwest type outcome. And that's because of the a lot of the impacts related to avian impacts with wind turbines and some of the other considerations for wind, but won't dwell on that. The transmission piece is also key. So the power of place findings, excuse me, I'm need to advance that one. The power of place findings for transmission initially showed, and there are a lot of other studies coming out on this, but this work showed that half of the transmission needs relative to those candidate project areas could be met through strategies like reconductoring or co-locating lines with existing infrastructure, so minimizing that footprint. The other half, new transmission infrastructure is needed to connect those dots. So just a couple land saving approaches that I'll mention. That was a component of that Power Place National. One of them is Mining the Sun. So the Mining the Sun program looks at working with communities, working with other stakeholders to identify areas like former mine lands, brown fields, other previously disturbed sites where something like solar could be located with few impacts on the landscape because it's already been disturbed. And at the same time, it can bring investment to these areas to redevelop them, remediate them, to make them positive outcomes for the community, both at the site level, economically, environmentally. I just want to put a plug in. The phase 1 report for all of our Mining the Sun work that's happened over the past 2 to 3 years is coming out, I think, later this week. Agrivoltaics is another thing that we've worked on. We have to approach this topic with a lot of curiosity, ask a lot of questions initially about what the opportunities, what the challenges are with this potential technology. I just want to highlight a study that we did in the Diamond Valley in north central Nevada. It looked at a groundwater basin that was overappropriated. They have a groundwater management plan there that requires that valley to reduce its water consumption over time. So we thought, well, could solar be a solution for that community as they're thinking about transitioning land use over time? Could be a source of economic revenue. So we explored various opportunities related to agrivoltaics and certain types of agriculture in that area. So collectively, these are some of the tools that are available to help inform our conversations collectively, to help inform potentially BLM decision making as you're thinking about things like the solar programmatic EIS, the Section 368 energy corridor planning for transmission lines, just some of the tools available, potential way to approach it. So that, I think I'm going to turn it over to June.
Okay, so first I wanted to say for those of you that were here for the Idaho Power presentation, which I thought was really good, the keynote this morning, I loved that first picture of the roller coaster. And I thought to myself, that would be a great opening slide for me to use. But for my experience so far with some of the stuff we've been trying to deal with renewable energy in Idaho, but it would be, the roller coaster would be flying off the rails and like in flames and like down. So I think it's been a really interesting, it's been interesting, I think, for a lot of us in BLM, Idaho at least, going through this process that we've been going through, just because even though there's been a lot of renewable energy work that BLM has done, really, this is really our first big foray into it in the States, and we've learned a lot. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is kind of how we got here, where we're at, and where we're going as far as renewable energy with the Bureau of Land Management. So first of all, does anybody know how many wind turbines that are on public land in the state of Idaho? Any guesses? 1,000? 0? It's actually 0. It really is. We actually don't have any on public lands, which, if you think through the sort of the general conversation that's happening now around wind authorization on public lands in the state, that's usually pretty surprising, So I think that's important. So I guess I would start with, the other piece of this is all of these pictures you see that have renewable energy on lands, they're on public lands, just not in our state. So that's my disclaimer as I start this presentation. So why do we even need to consider it as an agency, right? Well, we're governed by FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and so as part of that mandate, we have to consider projects that come in the doors and ask for right-of-ways, for generation, transmission, any kind of distribution of energy. That's part of what we do, right? We have to do that analysis. And we have a legal responsibility to respond to any application that comes in the door. So a lot of times we'll hear, why don't you just say no? We can't do that, right? We can't do that at the start. We have to actually get the information. We have to process that. We have to go through a process to disclose all of those impacts and ultimately make a decision. And it's complicated, right? We talked a little bit in the, in the second panel about balance. This is no decisions that we make on public land are easy anyway. But this is definitely, it's very complicated because I think the definition of balance is different for everyone, and we have to be able to account for that somehow and make that part of our dialogue and conversation. So what is our baseline? Where are we starting? Right now we have one wind turbine that's been authorized but never constructed on public lands. We have 0 solar projects that are currently authorized on public lands. We do have 2 geothermal leases, but they're both non-producing. So that's sort of where we're at right now. That's the snapshot of our current situation. There was one utility scale wind project that was authorized in 2006 in the Burley Field Office, but that was never constructed. And when we're talking about, when we're talking about how renewable energy and what that means to us, we don't include hydro in that, even though we know hydro is obviously part of this conversation as well. It's not something that we deal with. Okay, so what kind of interest are we seeing? So in the last 3 to 4 years, we've had a lot more interest that's been we've been having in the state, and then also just across the West in general. We have one application that's currently we're working on right now that's going through the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA analysis, and that's the Lava Ridge Wind Project. We have an initial screening right now for 2 wind projects, 11 solar projects, and then 28 geothermal nominations. So those are in the door and projects that we're looking at and starting to do analysis on. So why are we seeing more interest now? And we've been talking about this all day long, right? A lot of it is transmission. Previously, there wasn't a way to move the energy, so there wasn't a market for it. Now we're really seeing that. And the other is the technology. Again, we've been hearing about that too, right? I think the stat from this morning was there's been an 85% decrease in price for storage, so it makes it so much more palatable. So it's something that we're seeing more and more of. I can't actually tell it if it advanced, sorry. And so then just a little bit of context in the state for the wind and solar on non-BLM lands, we're looking at about 970 megawatts of wind and 830 megawatts of solar. So, and the solar is mostly residential, mostly utility. There's a little bit of residential in that. Okay, so what drives location? When we're talking about where are we actually going to site these? Where are people looking at it, right? Where are we looking to put these projects? Part of it for us is our resource management plans, which those are the plans on all of the different field offices and the public lands for Bureau of Land Management. And we've gone through and we've made allocation decisions. We've said based on all of the things that are happening, all of the environmental actions, all of the existing habitat that are on these different pieces of land, that they would or would not support different uses. And renewable energy is another allocation that we would also look at as part of that. We do also look at proximity to transmission. I mean, that's obviously another reason that you'd want to put a project near transmission because it's a shorter distance, saves money, it's faster, it just makes more sense. And then resource availability. Is there actually wind or sun? Obviously important. So we do have some new planning direction that's coming out. We're working on the sage-grouse plans right now. There is some language in those plans related to allowability for renewable energy. We also have there's a much larger scale of programmatic environmental impact statement that's being done across the West for solar. So some of the other BLM states, sorry, I'm having a hard time with my glasses to like read, see, and actually do this. So for some of the other states, a lot of it depends what we're measuring based on which state has the most sort of renewable activity related to public lands. So for wind and solar, by the energy that's actually generated, California is the largest for approved projects, but Nevada has the most that are currently under review. And then for wind and solar by public land footprint, Wyoming is the largest approved and under review. And then geothermal is Nevada. Okay, so I think we saw this slide this morning. This is the solar slide that talks about, I mean, again, it makes it pretty obvious. Most of the activity for all of the solar work has really been in the southwestern states, but as transmissions come in, as the technologies have gotten cheaper, we're just able to expand out to more areas. So that's another reason you're seeing that. And similarly with wind, as the technologies have gotten better, they can move to areas where there maybe the wind wasn't as resource rich, but we're able to deal with the technologies to be able to capture that. So this is the one I was trying to get to. So this slide really shows the yellow is the gold is the public lands, BLM lands. So if you see the red lines, that's actually the transmission lines. Those are the approved transmission lines across the state. And those little triangles are not all, but a fair amount of the substations that are also located across the state. So when you're thinking about where these projects are going to be sited, it's really all around those distribution areas. The B2H that we talked a little bit about, that's over in the western part of the state. But Gateway West is coming through from the Wyoming side, and it's going to go all the way across the state and hook up with the Boardway to Hemingway, B2H. And then the one coming from the south is the Southwest Intertie that we talked about earlier, which everyone sort of calls SWIP. Just fun facts. So location, project scale, factors that drive how the particular proposal is designed, right? We're looking at what are the site-specific details, what kind of data and information do we need? These are the kind of things that we need to be looking at when we're doing our analysis. This is all part of our National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA analysis that we do. We do extensive outreach and get feedback from tribes, partner agencies, interest groups, all the affected users that are specified based on the activities that happen in those areas. So it might be permittees, and then also the public, of course. Any of that information informs a decision on whether or not we're actually going to approve the proposal. There's a lot of things that happen between when somebody walks in the door and then when the decision actually gets made. And then the microscale is actually, where is it actually going to be sited within that footprint? There's a lot of real site-specific surveys that have to be done to be able to determine what's on the ground, everywhere from biological to archaeological. So this is really where I wanted to spend most of the time. So this is the lessons learned, right? So we kind of got here, here's how we got here, here's where we're at, and this is what we learned so far and how we're moving forward. So the first thing we learned is early and frequent engagement is really important. We deal with projects all the time that get authorized on public lands, soup to nuts, you name it, it pretty much happens on public lands, and we tend to go through some sort of process to make a determination whether or not we can actually authorize it. So one of the things that caught us a little off guard with this first really big renewable energy project was that there's a lot of windmills. When you drive around Idaho, you see that, right? So it didn't seem like initially like this was so different than what we already have going on in the state. We found out really quickly that was not the case, hence the burning roller coaster. Was pretty quick that we found out that was definitely not how we should be considering this, right? People were super concerned about what was happening on the ground. They were super concerned about lack of information of what was out there, what was being proposed. We didn't really have a really good way to educate people. And honestly, we were learning as well at the time, right? So we've really learned from that experience moving forward. And what we have come to with a lot of work with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Labs, with a lot of our headquarters, also working a lot with some of the other states that have dealt with a lot of these larger projects, is that we really need a process that we can have to engage with the proponents when they walk in the door with the idea, so that there's a whole lot of work that can happen before we actually perfect a project that's going to come in that we need to now work on. The other thing that happened last year is there were some rules that were passed for some specific timelines for environmental impact statements. And anyone that has worked with us in the past or worked with any federal agency, sometimes these EISs for these big projects and plans, they can go on for a really, really long time. And so last year there was some legislation passed, some rules made that said that we needed to have, if we're going to do an environmental impact statement, we need to have it done within 2 years of initiation. So that was a really big change for us. And I think all of us would say it was good that it happened, but it really has changed the way we're looking at projects. So someone coming in with a kind of an idea where we would start doing a lot of work on the idea and maybe we should put it here, or maybe it would have these attributes or those attributes. We don't really have time to do that anymore. We need to have all of that information up front so we understand what we're getting ourselves into. We can prioritize the projects, and then we actually can get them done within those timeframes. So it's put us on a track of streamlining that makes a lot of sense, but it has also really helped inform our process moving forward on how we're dealing with renewable projects in Idaho. So one of the things that we wanted to work with the proponents on is that there's a whole lot of outreach, mostly, that has to happen ahead of time. The expectation is that if a proponent comes in and says, I want to do a project on this piece of land, they're going to meet with the people that are in those areas, the affected people, the interest groups, the counties. They're going to have a lot of those conversations, work through a lot of those challenges up front, start looking at what are some of the conflicts, the resource conflicts you might have. You know, if there's wildlife corridors or if there's sage grouse areas, you know, how is that going to get dealt with? And that gets put into a report that then comes to us as part of the application, where we then can look at that and say, how complicated is this going to be? How much work has been done to be able to identify the issues ahead of time? And what will that look like moving forward? So we then can make a decision on how we prioritize that with our work. So going through the process, I talked about this a little bit. That stage one is that pre-application process. That's really where we're trying to look at what's the lay of the land. What are people saying? What's the interest level of the community? What kind of things have the proponents, the people that are bringing the projects into us, what have they done with those communities to try to move those things forward, and educate and gain support, which has been really important. Then moving into that application stage, then we actually would take in the application, make some determinations on where we can prioritize that with all of our other work. We've spent an inordinate amount of time on Lava Ridge in particular. We've put a lot of resources towards it, which is really important. And we want to do that and we need to do that. But we also need to do that in the context of the rest of our work as well, right? So what does that look like? So we now have a prioritization process. It's very similar to a process that Nevada has used in the past that has worked really well for them. So far, we feel like we've got a lot of support. We've been having a lot of really good conversation with the applicants and the proponents when they walk in the door. So we're hoping that continues. Okay. So the other thing, of course, that's really important is how the public can actually weigh into these conversations. Like I said earlier, we just can't say no, right? We have to go through a process that lays out what all of the issues are, discloses all of the environmental impacts, and then proposes a way to move forward that mitigates those impacts. So there's a lot of opportunity for the public as part of the NEPA process. As part of our pre-NEPA process, there's also a lot of opportunity as well. So our desire and hope is that we're going to get more people interested, more people that can come to the table, bring the concerns ahead of time so we can deal with them through the process. And then I talked a little bit about, we have the solar PEIS going on and the sage-grouse plan as well. Right now, we're not working on any land use plans within the state. We're going through a land use analysis to look at all of our plans across the state, make a determination of where we need to make some changes. One of the things that we didn't do when we did some of these plans, which some of them are very old, nobody really thought about renewable energy, right, as an allocation that we needed to consider on the public land. So that's something we need to look at moving forward and make some decisions on where's the right place to put it and how we're going to deal with it. This is just a map to give you a little bit of context. BLM, we do multiple use management. So how do we actually find consensus, right? Like I said, it's really a messy process. So even if you're just looking at sage-grouse habitat, which is on there, big game migration corridors, wilderness study areas, grazing allotments, there's not a lot of areas that don't have color. And so what that tells you is that there's not a lot of areas that you could literally walk into and not have an impact on something that was important to somebody. And so that's why that dialogue and that early engagement is really important. So one of the things that we've been thinking more and more about is the question might not really be where we need to find consensus on siting projects, but really where can we put projects where the trade-offs are something that are palatable to the public, right? It's a different question. You can't have all uses everywhere. And there, we talked a little bit about solar. If you have a solar currently, the way solar is, basically it's an exclusion area. If we permit a solar site, there's really nothing else that can go on in that area, or not much that can go on in that area. So for all intents and purposes, it's an exclusion. We haven't really talked about that much. That's something that the public really needs to weigh in on. We need to hear from people, how people feel about that. And it's going to differ depending on where we're talking about the site, depending on what the interests are to anyone in those areas. That's all something that has to be sort of talked through and get on the table so we can work through some of those issues. And so I guess the last thing is the most important part, and this is something I think that we heard from the county commissioner from Lincoln County. The projects, we want to make sure that projects are located somewhere that they aren't disproportionately affecting a given population. That's something that's really important. And so, I'm hoping, we talked a lot about tools, a lot of the tools you talked about, the place-based, look. I think we're developing a lot of tools that are going to get us to be able to have a much more robust conversation of what that looks like. And I think going forward, we need to engage locally. We need to have those conversations. It doesn't do us any good to just pass rules or laws that say, well, you can't do this here, you can't do this there, right? We need to have a conversation. It's a moving target. This is basically a living process. We're learning new things every day. So we're excited to be able to be here today and talk about it, and hoping that we're going to be able to continue to have more robust conversation moving forward.
Thank you, June. We'll let Chris get the final word here. Again, please fill out your cards if you have any questions. I'd be happy to get them in front of the panel.
So I'm gonna, if you'll indulge me a bit, I'm gonna try and pull the different speakers together. The people at my table were laughing at me because I've taken like 4 pages of notes today as other people have been speaking. And I'm gonna try and tie that all together in a bow. You can let me know later how I do. How many people in the room have heard of WECC, who I work for, Western Electricity Coordinating Council? Okay, more than I thought. So to give you kind of a baseline for my organization and what we do, we have the responsibility to identify and mitigate risks in the bulk power system in the Western interconnection. And so Stephanie on the first panel showed a map of the Western interconnection. That's my jurisdiction. So we have 14 Western states, Alberta and BC, Canada, and Baja, Mexico. And it is our job to enforce standards and to identify and mitigate risks and ensure reliability, any action that promotes reliability. So our organization is located in Salt Lake City. This gives you a frame of reference for how fast this train has moved with regard to energy. We started as a trade organization, WECC did, in the 60s. And at that time, the only computer in the Western interconnection that could run the studies on the data that the utilities were providing us was at the University of Utah. So WECC is located in Salt Lake City because then, right, that was where part of what we do, our organization holds an anchor data set, which means that all of the utilities in the Western interconnection, whether you're public power, federal power marketer like BPA, or an investor-owned utility like Idaho Power, they provide their data and we aggregate that data so that we have a look. We are independent, we have an independent board. We are resource neutral because the priority is reliability, not a green grid. My apologies. I know this is an environmental conference. And we are the only organization that has an interconnection-wide view. And so we run data to figure out risks, and the highest risks, which have been talked about a little bit today here and there, are weather-related events, cyber and physical threats to the system. We do not have enough resources to capture all of the load that's being added to the system, and we don't have enough transmission to get resources from place to place. So several years ago, one of the Oregon commissioners at a conference said, "It's everything everywhere all at once." And I thought it was genius. And then I learned that it's actually a movie. So it wasn't an original, right? She didn't come up with it herself. But it really well explains, I think, where we're at with energy and electricity on the grid as a whole, and particularly in the Western interconnection. Everything everywhere all at once. We're getting hit with electrification, which is removing people from natural gas, right, and adding them to electric. We've got transportation electrification, which different states now have pushed through legislation for when they're not going to sell new fuel cars. They're all going to be electric. I think that's just California right now, but I could be wrong. And when commissions and energy offices don't act in a way that legislatures think that they ought to be acting, then legislatures get involved, and that's really fun. We've got a transmission authority in Colorado. There's a transmission authority that's been constituted by the legislature in New Mexico. And so everybody's got their fingers in everything. And so you can hear from all these different speakers and try to understand what's happening and clean green. And I really appreciated Adam's sort of balanced approach to things, because that's where we're at, right? Reliability is the key here. And that's going to take everybody pushing in the same direction, collaborating on things. And I don't know if y'all have noticed, but Idaho doesn't have the same politics as the coastal states, more or less. I mean, look at Idaho as a whole and not just Boise, right? And so the map that Stephanie showed, I see different things that weren't actually on her map, because there's over 30 balancing authorities in the Western interconnection. There's, 100 and something load serving entities, right? There's 2 federal power marketers. You've got BPA and WAPA. Public power is part of it. Tribal is part of it, right? And we're trying to do something that takes coordination across all of these varying jurisdictions. To listen to Commissioner Wood talk about the local counties passing ordinances, like, that strikes fear in my heart, right? Because the only way that we are going to get to the clean green grid that everyone seems to want, and in varying degrees, right? California's pushing really hard. Oregon and Washington are kind of right behind them. Idaho, not directly behind them, but somewhere, right? Somewhere in there. And definitely the utilities in Idaho have a vested interest in getting to that clean green grid. And part of the reason that people are here, and part of the reason they're moving here, and part of the reason that businesses are coming here is because of the lowest rates in the nation. I don't know if y'all know that or not, but that the reality is, and the truth of that is, that rates are going to go up. You cannot build the generation that we need and the transmission that we need without rates going up. And that doesn't mean that our rates are going to be more expensive than California, because California's are going up too, right? Spoiler alert, everyone across the nation is building right now for electrification of the grid. And it's going to take everyone getting together at a table, being willing to talk about. It's like any other negotiation, right? You go into the negotiation knowing what you can give and knowing where your non-gives are. And we have to be able to come to the table and talk to one another, whether you're pro energy or not so pro, right? For clean, green energy. We've got to be able to pull those people together to a table, and everyone has to be able to give somewhere, or we're not going to make it to where we want to. The WECC does what's called a Western Assessment of Resource Adequacy every year. My team helps with that. And this past year, in November, I think 2023, we issued our last assessment. So this is an assessment of resources in the Western interconnection and how the utilities are doing, all the utilities, public power, investor-owned utilities are doing. And what the Western assessment showed is that in the 1 to 3, maybe 1 to 4 year time frame, we're okay. We're only okay because of the delayed retirement of resources. And anyone who pays attention to energy and anything with regard to the grid knows what I'm talking about, right? There was early retirement of like coal resources and things like nuclear in California, and they've backed off those dates now. So in the short term, our most recent Western assessment shows, because of these retirements, we'll be okay with regard to resources. But in that 4 to 10 year time frame, there are not enough resources to meet the needs of the customers. Think about that, right? The utilities have an obligation to serve their load, and people are moving here. And there has to be balance in how this is going to work. You have to understand that while clean, green energy is a goal for all of us, WECC's not anti-clean, green energy, that the grid can only take so much, right? And if the transmission lines aren't there, like I was talking with Adam earlier, and we were laughing because Idaho Power, when I started in the industry, most of your childhoods ago, Idaho Power had what was called peaker plants. They have a couple of peaker plants in their system. Those are meant to only go on, they're natural gas plants. They're meant to only go on during the peaks of the year. They're not meant to run all the time, because to run them is expensive, right? But it's okay because you're only supposed to run them a couple of times a year. They're running their peaker plants all the time now. So if that gives you any frame of reference for how it is that they're able to continue to meet load currently, right? That is where we're at. So sorry to be the wet blanket on all the things. But I also wanted to say, with regard to particularly June's comments, it is funny, if you're, depending on the group that you're in, people have different mindsets. And I just recently spoke to the Idaho Bar Association energy sector, and one of the guys in the audience asked about NEPA. And I am not a NEPA expert. I don't want to be a NEPA expert. I will leave that to the people who do that all the time. But what I know is that NEPA and the federal agencies and federal and public land are not the only impediment to building transmission and to getting generation built and moving generation to load, right? There are issues that were touched on earlier, governance issues, jurisdiction issues, right? It is hard to build lines across state lines right now because state commissioners in different places, which I used to be, so I have a unique perspective on this, right? State commissioners in different states have different interests. Go figure, right? If you're Oregon, Washington, Idaho, or Utah. And so governance matters, right? Giving up authority to somebody else across a state line and what it's going to cost your customers. There are mindsets out there that California is trying to export its clean energy policy, right? I don't know. Is transmission getting built because California has an abundance of renewable energy resources that it keeps building, not necessarily to serve their load, but to meet their energy requirements? Yes, that's actually true. But if Idaho gets the benefit of that, ultimately, I spoke to the legislature a little while back, and my argument was, I mean, if California wants to produce all that energy, and during the highest peak times of the day that solar is getting produced, and they don't have enough customers to actually take all the load that's being produced, they want to sell it to Idaho really cheap, we ought to want to take that energy, right? And then when the sun goes down in California and they need energy, happy to sell them back, right? What Idaho produces in their other plants. So I'm not saying coal needs to stay forever, but we are taking baseload resources that have a certain frequency and impact on the grid, right? They provide a constant signal to the grid, these baseload resources like natural gas and coal. And we're replacing them with variable generation like wind and solar. And that changes the impact on the grid. My organization does studies, and we're having a hard time right now trying to figure out exactly the impact on the grid. Inverter-based resources is sort of the term of art, right, for the variable resources. Inverter-based resources operate differently on the grid than baseload like coal and natural gas do. And we have to learn these things because I think it was the last panel talked about unintended consequences. Things will happen when we don't know what we don't know, right? So I would ask for, right, patience. I think getting more engineers here, that was my bid at the beginning of this panel, right? Let's get more people in who are learning all the things, who are smart, who can help us with this so that we can move the ball the way that everyone wants to move the ball, but in a way that ultimately maintains reliability of the grid. Because what everyone wants ultimately, which Adam's data showed, I think, right? Well, they like affordability. They also want to flip their switch and be able to have the lights come on, right? They don't like rolling blackouts and brownouts. And June made a comment about why more now, right? It's electrification, it's growth, it's need for resources and transmission. And this isn't our grandmother's electric grid, right? The electric grid got built before there were a whole bunch of requirements and EIS and all the things that June spoke to, all the processes that we now have to go through in order to build, in order to get any of that on. Transmission takes 15 years to build. And we needed it 2 years ago, right, in order to get generation to load. So I'll stop there. I'm not kidding. I have so many notes from all the people. I love that President Trump started with, we've created a lot of problems for you to fix. I can't wait to see what y'all do with it.
Thank you, Chris, for synthesizing many of those thoughts. And these are some great questions. We'll touch on transmission and issue in a moment. But earlier today we heard Stephanie Lenhart say we need to rethink the process for grid governance. We heard Nancy Hirsch say we need to get engaged stakeholders before the line on the map gets drawn. And a question for you, June, from an audience: how does the BLM define community consent in its review process?
I don't know if we define community consent. I think we define community engagement. I think we engage the community. We identify, who is affected by our projects, locations they are, by the resources they're going to affect. We do outreach. We do public meetings. I mean, we try to do everything we possibly can to get the public interested in the things that are going on in those areas. And depending on the project, we may or may not get people that are interested in the early stages. Sometimes they wait until the end, and then when they finally realize what's happening, that's when they finally get engaged. We have a lot of tools within the agency to be able to expand our timeline as far as feedback, getting feedback from the public. We do regularly, we extend public comment timelines and do specific outreach. So, so as far as public consent, it's public input, right? It can't, our decisions are based on a myriad of things, and a big part of that is what the public wants, but that's not the only part of it, right? We have to look at what's the best use and the highest use on that piece of land.
Okay, a question for Peter. In the power of place studies, Peter, how did you determine what are conflict areas? Are those only based on environmental sensitivities or with other factors like political, tribal, cross-border?
Yeah, great. I'm glad that that question was asked. So the power of place constraints areas incorporate 31, I believe, different constraint categories. And those range from environmental. They also include cultural resource areas. So it takes environmental and social considerations into account as part of those constraint areas. So 31 different criteria, and all of those data points are on the website.
Great. And this is perfect because we have June and Peter sitting next to each other, synthesizing two of these questions. How do reports like the power of place inform agency decisions? Or if they do, why not?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, we look at, excuse me, when we have a project that's in front of us that's been proposed, we look at a myriad of information. The other thing we do is we also do outreach to different groups that have expertise in areas that we feel like would be beneficial in our analysis moving forward. And then we enter into these cooperating agency agreements with them to be able to use their information. I think the place-based work you guys have done is really interesting. I think it gives us a dimension that's different maybe than we've thought about in the past. And I think the complications in our world are changing. I think over the past 10 years, that's really become evident. We're still learning as an organization and changing and adapting. I think the work that's come out has been super helpful. And BAS has worked with us on other projects as well and talked about what that is and how that can inform our decisions. And I mean, I think it's another tool in the toolbox for us, which is always beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's how the Nature Conservancy views itself as a partner with the BLM, bringing these tools in conversations, whether it's, BAS or someone else from Idaho TNC coming to your office and talking to you about it. We have conversations with your counterparts throughout the West and sharing these tools. And it's, I think it's really an opportunity to just share different perspectives for consideration, because having worked on the NEPA process for a long time as a contractor, I know that the BLM is flooded with information during these NEPA processes, and you're looking for like really solid data and information so you can make an informed decision at the end of the day. And that's what the NEPA process is about, is collecting information, various perspectives, disclosing the information that was collected, and then making an informed decision at the end of the day. So that's what an organization like TNC is trying to do with a tool like Power of Place, and then having conversations with you and, just being a partner in that process.
And if I can chime in on this one, I think the studies are awesome, and different organizations do different studies across the interconnection and across the country. And ultimately, you have to have someone take that plan, that transmission plan, and do something with it. And oftentimes that is actually where the hiccup is, which is why I said it's not just BLM and trying to get permitting across federal or public lands, that there are a lot of really good studies out there, yours included, and somebody needs to take that and go forward with that, right? That's the economics of it. That's who's going to pay for it, where it's going to go, who's going to get the benefit. That analysis has to occur in order for it to be built. And so we have 2 decades of studies with different terrific organizations, and we have been unable in the West to try to get the parties together to build, right? Because it's about who gets to, the capital investment and the monies that flow from that, and who gets subscribed on the line, and who's going to pay for it, and is it all the customers, and what are the benefits? Do they have to be tangible or not tangible? And so I appreciate the study, and all of the really smart people that have put a lot of work into those things. And I wish we had a way to harness that next step, to be able to get someone to take it and run with it and actually do the work and build so that the transmission's available to the customers.
So, Chris, you asked it as a rhetorical question, but it's kind of an actual question about transmission lines in particular. We heard Peter talk about reconductoring, but they are multi-million-dollar infrastructure investments. And, like you said, we wish they were built yesterday. But who should be making those decisions then, as you just asked? Utilities, states, local counties?
Ultimately, that's a great question. For an investor-owned utility, the person that makes that decision is the Public Utilities Commission. So there's different people in each state that are commissioners for their state commission. The majority of the West are appointed commissions, including Idaho. There's a couple still left. Arizona may be the only one. Arizona and Montana are elected commissioners. Everybody else is appointed by the governor, and it is those people in those seats that the investor-owned utility goes to say, here are the costs that we incurred. Please tell us that they were prudently incurred and reasonable so that we can put them into customers' rates. And so the investor-owned utilities then tread lightly, right? They're careful about, they're not just going to run ahead with an investment because it looks good to them. They need more than just that. And we have an environment in the West that is looking at markets now too, right? And so there's the state jurisdiction, and then you've got CAISO, which is a market, SPP, which is a market, the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which has a portion of the West for resource adequacy. And so there's not a single answer, right? And we have our Canadian partners and the partners in the little swath of Baja, Mexico that we need to consider as well in those decisions.
And there's a follow-up question regarding that very thing. You keep asking the questions the listeners are asking. So sorry, you get to answer them too. WECC covers U.S., Canada, Mexico. Who do you engage with in Baja or Alberta? And how does that work? What are those challenges cross-border?
That's a great question. In Mexico right now, it's a matter of public record, so I'm not telling any secrets. Mexico has a market that runs things called SENACE, and the Mexican government ultimately has authority over a lot of the things that happen down there. And right now, they're not paying to be a part of WECC, and yet they still react and respond. The people in Baja, Mexico still react and respond to the CAISO, who is their reliability coordinator. Again, different jurisdictions for different stuff, right? But so they are interconnected. Baja, Mexico is interconnected as part of the Western Interconnection, and an event there could cascade across the Western Interconnection. And they're doing okay reacting and responding to us right now. And they, they have events occasionally and things happen. And we are in ongoing negotiations with them because their government has recently switched, and I think they're not sure how much they want to interact and or pay for the services that are provided to them. And then with Canada has Alberta and British Columbia are both interconnected in the Western Interconnection, and Alberta has the AESO, which is their market, and then in BC, because all the provinces up there are different too, they have the BCUC, which is the British Columbia Utility Commission, who is similar to a U.S. commission, but not exactly. And when Congress does things, Congress doesn't have authority over Canada, but if they direct U.S. entities to do particular things, it necessarily impacts those people who are interconnected to that part of the grid. So I'm not sure if I answered that exactly for what they were looking for, but it's a challenge. And the standards, which are mandatory in the U.S., Canada goes through an additional process. We don't just, because they become mandatory standards in the U.S., like tree trimming, vegetation management, all kinds of things, right? It's not just presumed then that Canada is in the same position. They go through an additional process in order to adopt those standards. So standards in the US are usually adopted by Canada about a year later because of the additional process that they go through in order to adopt it for their province.
Great. And we're so happy to have a BLM representative here as well. And this next question goes to you, June. Well, one of the other questions was, how do we hold developers accountable for early community engagement and responsible building? And then more specifically, another question, the new renewable energy rule describes that soon after a project application is submitted, developers are required to meet with tribal governments to facilitate coordination of potential issues. Are we really trusting developers to know about reservation versus ancestral lands and how to approach tribes in a timely and respectful way?
Yeah, all good questions. So I think part of what our goal is with that pre-NEPA process is holding the developers responsible, because if they don't go through it and have a thoughtful process, do the outreach, make sure they're doing the studies, they have all their sort of ducks in a row when they come in the door, the consequence of that is that project would be prioritized very low as far as us working on that. So there's actually, it incentivizes them to actually do all of that upfront work ahead of time, and be able to come in with a pretty well-baked project that has already buy-in, or if it doesn't have complete buy-in, we at least know where the pitfalls are. That's the thing that would get it prioritized higher on the list for us to actually start working on. As far as the engagement with the tribal governments, that was something that, we definitely saw a lack in, and something that is historically is a challenge. We have consultation as part of our normal actions, our normal activities. So we meet with tribal governments on a regular basis to go over our projects. But, that's obviously not a requirement for a developer. So when we put that process together and highlighting that as one of the areas of focus, that's not, the idea isn't that they would just know what to do. It's a dialogue between us and the developer through, as they're working through that. So, what our desire would be to help them, right, to help have those conversations, to help sort of guide them in what those conversations should be, give them information about the things that they should be looking for and the kind of things they should be asking about. So I don't think any of the expectation is that, we would just hand them a piece of paper that says, here's what the process is, have at it. It's a dialogue, right? It's a back and forth, constant back and forth that we expect to be right there at the table with them. So.
Thank you. Peter, this one's for you. How was your organization work to gain public support of renewable energy projects or those practical solutions? How do you intend to engage with the general public through Power Place and other activities?
Yeah, so in multiple ways, through venues like this, sharing the tool that is available, getting your feedback on it. I mean, we certainly always want to improve our work. I think one of the great things that the Nature Conservancy does is facilitate communication between multiple stakeholders. That's just kind of, I've been with the Nature Conservancy about 2 years, and one of the great things that I've experienced is how our teams can meet with so many different people who have so many different perspectives to find common solutions on really challenging topics like the ones that we're talking about today. And it's, a lot of it is listening. A lot of it is taking information in, finding out where there are gaps, and bringing different perspectives to the table, or developing tools like Power Place that we can share with the BLM or share with local communities, tribal communities, with developers, with transmission developers and utilities. I think we did a road show with Power Place, and we communicated it to dozens of stakeholders. And the exciting thing is that we're seeing it being used now as kind of a baseline for some additional work that's being done, like Rocky Mountain Institute is looking at it, or some other groups as a potential kind of input to their work. So that's exciting to see.
Well, it seems that there's a wave of work coming. June, you'd mentioned 40 applications in initial screening. It sounds like more is on the horizon. Here's a question, and I don't know who should grab it. How do public agencies, proponents, reconcile the large portion of transmission lines that would have to also cross private lands? Is there a role for eminent domain?
Good question.
I guess what I'll say about that is, eminent domain is a very touchy subject, especially in the West. And, that's not something obviously that we would ever get involved in as far as BLM. I'm going to go on the record as saying that. So yeah, I think that's a challenge. We talked a little bit about, or heard a little bit about some of the thoughts on, private ground and what we should or shouldn't have an expectation that people who own a piece of property are going to have to do, and I think there might come a time maybe where that's something that has to be on the table to have a conversation about. I don't think we're there yet. That's my opinion. I think we still have a lot of room between where we're at now and talking about eminent domain, where there's a lot of solutions that could come together that would alleviate a need for something like that.
A follow-up question on transmission lines, unless someone else had another comment.
I was just going to
Okay,
say,
I'm sorry,
eminent
Chris, yeah.
domain, from my prior role as a commissioner, eminent domain is generally seen as a last resort. And the public doesn't like it, right? And especially investor-owned utilities don't like to do things that the public doesn't like. I mean, they have to sometimes, but eminent domain is sort of a degree beyond.
Well, we heard June earlier mention the 2-year timeline for EIS and some changes there. This audience member asked, are there efforts to otherwise simplify the permitting process so we can move more quickly on these projects and specifically about transmission?
So, I'll just talk about NEPA for 1 second. That's just one piece of a much larger puzzle of getting transmission done, right? So, I think the goal of streamlining is always really important. I think it gets really complicated really quickly. One thing I think will be beneficial is having a place to go where it's all in one place so you know what it is. Because I feel like it's a little bit of a black box when you talk about, it's just like permitting. And that means different things to everybody, right? And most of the time I feel like people think that is just NEPA, and NEPA is just one little piece of that. So.
And just to build on that, one exciting thing that we saw be proposed last year is proposed rulemaking related to a categorical exclusion, which is kind of the lowest tier of the NEPA review process. The rulemaking would apply to things like reconductoring power lines or co-locating lines on existing infrastructure. There was also a component about locating solar on previously disturbed sites. Some of those types of activities could be considered a categorical exclusion, which means that they could, in theory, get through the NEPA process faster because there would be fewer impacts.
And one last thing on that would be that I just lost it. Never mind. I
Okay,
passed.
We'll come back.
Darn.
For anyone here, question: how do you mitigate threats from bad actors, cyber attacks, physical attacks, etc.? I suppose they're talking about, transmission and siting, and I think we even heard the CEO of Idaho Power talk about an attack, which.
Yeah, so our systems are absolutely locked down. We don't use AI in-house at all. Our systems, our IT and the executive team have said for now we're not allowing it because of the cyber threats that come from that. We went from dual authentication to triple authentication when you try and get into programs on your computer. We don't use little thumb drives anymore. Apparently I'm having problems with the English language. We don't use thumb drives in our computers because you can introduce things. And where are solar panels produced? Think about that for a minute. The majority of solar panels are produced in China, right? And where's technology developed? Technology is developed in areas that are not necessarily the US. And so the utilities are actually beginning to come to conclusions that there are things within their system that they have used over time, which seemed harmless, that are not in fact harmless. And so the cyber actors are real and they are a constant threat, and physical threats are a big deal as well, and a real concern for everybody who's part of the system. But cyber's I don't even know where to begin, right? You could do days on cyber. There are so many threat actors out there that want to figure out how to pull down the grid.
And we're seeing that, across the pond in conflicts. And I know INL here in our state and some of our universities here are leaning more into fortifying cybersecurity. Here's a question for anyone. It's kind of a question that we all touched on a bit, and we heard in regards to Lincoln County as well. Who's the best messenger for accurate information about the pros and cons of renewable energy projects? Can all point to each other.
We talked about that a little bit over our lunch. I think, and I'll use our Lava Ridge experience as an example. We didn't get ahead of it as far as having those conversations. So what filled the void was a lot of information that may or may not be real or true, but at the point where you try to refute it, right now you're looked at as someone who is just, well, you're just lying. So I think I don't know who the right person is or who the right group is, but I do think that there is value in thinking through a strategy ahead of time and having sort of the right people at the table to have those conversations back to the community, to the legislature, to all these different places where you potentially, if you don't have the conversation, something else will fill the void. Right.
I think that's a great note to end on. Please join me in thanking our panelists.